Good morning, everyone. Namaste. Let me also join Amit in welcoming you all. It's great to see some of the familiar faces. I've seen some of these faces over the years. And I think now SCNC has become a sort of part of the calendar, in a sense, of conferences on education. And we see that impact of the conference also in terms of how far we are able to take these ideas to the larger audience within the media as well as among the policy makers. So it's very good to see many of you here. You have been supporting this conference for a long time. And I'm hopeful that with the new education policy being around the corner, we are going to be able to have some more influence on what gets into that education policy document. Right? I'm glad that Mr. Jay Panda is also here. He has been writing quite often, has been speaking about this issue of education, and of course many other issues in terms of what matters to us as citizens of India. Right? And I'm sure he would have quite a bit to contribute in terms of what kind of ideas we should be pushing for within the new education policy. What I want to do is take you through quickly some of the consultations and meetings we have done, right, on new education policy. We have done quite a few meetings around the country, not just with educationists, but also with investors, meaning people who are investing in the education sector, right? Large number of NGOs and academics who work in this area. And distilling from those meetings, we have created a set of recommendations for the MHRD and also for larger public, right? You would see there is a document in your folder. This one document which actually Amit mentioned, which is about you voting on the top 3 reform ideas out of 10 or 12 that we have put on one page. So please do vote and tell us what you think are the important issues in the regulatory arena. This is the document that I'm talking about with a sort of round graph on the charts on the top, right? So these are the set of recommendations which apply to the education system as a whole. It also applies to schools and students and then teachers and principals, right? These recommendations actually are for the both private schools as well as for public government schools, right? What I want to do this morning is not so much focus on the government schools part of it, also not focus within the private school, focus only on budget private schools. As we define them, they are the schools which charge far lower fees than the per child expenditure of the government in government schools, right? Which is actually a very good way of defining what's a budget private school. A school which charges fees less than the government spends in government schools per student, right? We also have a data from NSSO through which we can also decide what's the average fee that the parents are currently paying. And that number also is one way of thinking about what is a budget private school in the Indian context. Obviously, as you know, it's not just one single number for the whole country, right? The number varies from state to state. Of course, it varies from district to district. So there is no one single number that defines what a budget private school is. Right? But it gives an idea of a different segment of the school ecosystem that we are focusing on. Let me just set the context, what we have been able to achieve so far. So I think one great achievement we have is the high enrollment numbers, right, which are now pretty close to 96, 98, some places, of course, 100% and above in primary, upper primary and elementary education, right? So that certainly is a great achievement for the country in terms of getting students in the school, right? Actually, even here, there's a very large role being played by the budget private schools. Of course, it's not very easy to figure out what proportion of the students are in budget private schools because we don't know the exact numbers. But it's quite clear that budget private schools play an important role in helping to achieve this milestone for the country, right? Just to give an example of how important that is, I know some of you remember 1991 reforms happened And as part of that, we had to borrow money from IMF and World Bank, right? And the conditions attached to that borrowing required the government of India would cut spending so that they can reduce the spending, raise some revenues, and repay the loan that we have taken from IMF and World Bank, cut spending across the board for quite a few years. So if you look at actually government spending in 92 onwards, right, is actually going down. The central government spending on education declines from 92 onwards all the way up to 1997, 98. Only then it begins to go up. And by end of the decade, of course, gets back to where it was in 92, right? So all throughout the 1990s, the government spending was declining. On the other hand, if you look at the literacy rates, in the 1991 census, the rate was about 52% literacy rate in India. In 2001 census, it increased to 65%, a 13% increase in the 10-year period between 91 and 2001. And that is the highest increase in rate of literacy that we have seen so far in our history. Even after 2001, it has not been 13%. Right? Actually, it's about 11%. So what is interesting sort of paradox to think about is that here you have a situation where government spending is declining because of the structural adjustment program that we had signed on, right? While the literacy rates are actually rising at the fastest rate than ever has been in the history of India. How is that possible? I think answer to that puzzle is actually budget private schools. In the mid-90s, those are the schools that began to come up in the slums and shanty towns of India, in second and third tier towns, and slowly also in the villages, right? And those schools are the ones that allowed us to achieve that high rate of literacy that we saw between 91 and 2001, despite the declining government spending during that decade, right? So even the universal enrollment is normally seen as the achievement of the government and the government programs. We have a large role to play even in that goal, right? Other thing that has happened, of course, is government infrastructure improvement. A large amount of money has been spent in the last 15 years in building this infrastructure. And certainly you see huge change. And some of you, of course, you travel around, would have seen some of the biggest and newest buildings in the villages of India are the school buildings, right? And that's a great investment that has been done. The key challenge still remains is the learning outcome, right? ASER survey, even the Government of India survey, NAS, the National Achievement Survey, all of them very clearly demonstrate that learning levels are declining, right? Numbers are there. Of course, you can quibble about the numbers a little bit here and there, but there is no doubt the levels are going down, right? So despite high enrollment, despite better infrastructure and high spending, learning levels are not improving as much as we would like. So that remains a key challenge. And I think second key challenge from a citizen's point of view is also the low value for money that we get in government schools, right? So what I have here in the chart is a yellow line that shows you the ratio of government to private school per student expenditure, right? You can see in UP, the first bar is about 12.8, about 13 times more is spent in UP in government schools than in private schools. This, of course, average of all private schools includes some of the high-fee schools also, right? So you can see how, in most cases, is multiple of what we spend in private schools is spent in government schools. The second bar gives you the efficiency, in a sense, of that spending, right? And here I've taken the reading data from ASER. So what you see there is the government and the private reading scores, right? So government reading score is about 0.4 in UP of the private, right? While they spend 13 times as much money in the state, right? Interesting state, obviously, is Tamil Nadu, which actually has a slightly higher score in government schools than in private schools. 1.2 that you see there shows you that private schools don't do as well as government schools in Tamil Nadu. But in every other state, it's less than 1. That means government schools don't do as well as private schools in reading proficiency of the students. Right? So this value for money is an important concern for us as citizens. We are spending 6, 7, 10, 12, 13 times more in government schools, but not getting the results that we should get. Right. So question is, what should we do about it? Right. Here, as I said, I focus only on the budget private school arena. The larger reform ideas are in the sheet that I mentioned to you earlier. Right. So series of ideas. This is something we've been discussing at NISA and also in other meetings in terms of what needs to be done. Fortunately, Mr. Manish Sisodia, hopefully he will be here in the afternoon. He has been part of this conversation himself, right? So at NISA meetings, he has been there, listening to some of these ideas himself, has suggested that he will form a committee of concern, BPS, and try to sort of address some of these issues, at least for Delhi. Right? And let's see what these issues are. So one of the key challenge for budget private schools, in a sense, or schools generally, is the fact that the government plays role of all sides of being a regulator, being a financier, and also a provider, meaning running of government schools. All of those roles are done by one single department. Right? What we would like to see is the role being separated. The biggest benefit would be the regulator becomes separate from the provider of running of government schools. Then the regulator would be able to set independent standards, which can apply to all schools, not just to private schools, but also to government schools, right? And that certainly is very important, not in terms of level playing field between the government and private school, but also in terms of our own concern as citizens of maintaining standards within government schools. Right. So separating this role is very important reform that we could ask for. Second, within the private sector, BPS is to be seen as a distinct category of schools. We cannot have the same norms that apply to DPS and Vasant Valley and international schools applied to schools which actually charge 1/10, 1/20th of those fees. Right. And therefore, the idea that low-fee private schools should be seen as an independent part of the larger private school ecosystem. Most important thing for the budget private school would be to change the recognition norms, which are currently based only on infrastructure and inputs. Right? So size of the land plot, size of classrooms, minimum 300 square feet, teacher qualifications. Right? Those are all infrastructure and input norms. Right? What we recommend is that government should focus on learning outcomes, which is what the schools are there for, right? And the defined recognition norms based on learning outcomes, which can also apply to government schools as they apply to private schools, right? So create a sort of focus on learning as opposed to on infrastructure. And there's a lot of research evidence, and many of you in the audience know who are involved in the research area, that global research quite clearly points out that even a simple thing like student-teacher ratio that we would assume would have a very direct impact on learning outcomes of students doesn't really make that big a difference, right? So if you had 35 students or 20 students in a classroom, the learning outcomes are not that different. Obviously, if you have 100 students, it would matter. But within a reasonable range, it does not really matter whether you have 35 or 45 students in a classroom or 15 or 20. Currently, the legal structure is very weak. We are society or a trust largely. And here, I think I also want to emphasize the duty of private schools. So one thing to ask what we want for ourselves is also important to realize that we have a larger social obligation as an education institution, right? And creating this separate legal entity would allow then government to fix disclosure norms, which would apply to then all education institutions, particularly schools as well as colleges, right? And those norms would then have to be abide by. So if you think about a public limited company, right, the norms they have to abide by could be easily applied and some more to schools and colleges, right? So I think there's a social obligation also in terms of transparency and accountability on our part. And I think it's important that we fulfill that part of our obligation in exchange for what we want from the country and the government. This is, I think, idea that we had talked about with Mr. Sisodia when he was imposing the fee regulation on private schools, we said, yes, parents do complain about fees, right? Just like any customer complains about high charges, right? So I also complain about when I go to restaurant how high the menu prices are. But there's a customer complaint, right? Which is quite distinct than a concern as a citizen that I have with how private schools operate, right? And so quite often in the government policy, both are getting confused, right? A customer complaint should be seen in that light and addressed in that manner, as opposed to trying to create that into a citizen concern and regulate across the board all private schools in terms of fees, in terms of salaries of teachers, infrastructure, and other things, right? So that's an important distinction to keep in mind as a customer versus citizen. We also recommend that government should publish data on private school performance. We are going to have learning outcome assessment being done of government and private schools. That data should be available to public to be able to make an informed choice which schools are performing better, and thereby create a competition which is focused on quality, I would say, gadgets, right? So what you see in many of the schools is a smart board, a CCTV camera, which obviously seem appealing to parents in terms of what the school is committing to, but probably don't really add value in terms of learning outcomes, right? So instead of gadgetry, the focus of competition should be on learning and students. Quickly, I think for schools and students, one important area is 25% seats in private schools. I know people have a difference of opinion on this issue in terms of some people support the idea, many actually oppose the idea for different reasons, right? But whatever may be your personal or school position, that's the law of the land and it's going to continue to be implemented unless we change the law. What we recommend here that money should be given to parents as opposed to schools, right? Primary reason is that concern the government has that many of the low-fee schools would begin to raise fees because per child expenditure in government schools is much higher than in private schools on average. In Rajasthan, for example, government survey shows that out of 26,000 private schools, 22,000 of them have fees lower than the per child expenditure of Rajasthan government, right? So the fear government has that if we start paying the per child expenditure of government schools, the private school will raise the price to match that amount and therefore collect more money from the government, right? So we are saying that give that money to parents. Of course, parents would pay the fees which are what the fees are, and the rest of the money would be an incentive for parent in order to cover the other cost of sending kids to private schools, right? And that's one good way of investing public money to keep kids in the school and invest in their further education. We can also recommend that maybe government can incentivize schools which do well by the 25% students, because they are likely to be behind the remaining 75%. Then they can be given some award or monetary incentive. One key concern for low-fee schools is the board exams, right? They are not going to be affiliated to CBSE board or any of the international boards because they don't meet the infrastructure norms, right? State boards are not seen as very good quality by the parents, so they want a different board exam, right? So it'll be interesting to think about a separate board or boards, not just one board, for low-fee private schools, right? Part of that could be opening CBSE board exam to all students. So even non-CBSE school student could probably appear for CBSE board exam and thereby be able to compete for better colleges for admission at that level. Few other ideas, I won't go over them, but it's sort of, you can quickly see that gives you some idea in terms of how to think about support that can be provided to budget private schools that perform well, right? Pakistan, of all countries, Bangladesh actually have programs, government programs that work directly with budget private schools in terms of giving vouchers to poor parents who want to send the kids to these schools, in terms of providing teacher training for teachers in these low-fee private schools run by the government, right? Or at least funded by the government. So there are many ways in which, if we believe that kids have the fundamental right, children have the fundamental right, then irrespective of the child goes to government school or a private school, as a state has an obligation to meet that fundamental right, right? And government can think quite openly about how to support the schools which are actually serving the larger national purpose, as I said in the beginning, we also have been responsible for larger enrollment numbers that we see in the country today. Right? So these are some of the ideas that could play a role in how we structure the debate, not just for today at the conference, but also in terms of the new education policy discussions and debate that are likely to happen, right? And what kind of ways in which we can put demands forward. And this is something that all of you would have to think about, how to reach out to the policymakers and policy influencers to make sure that this work gets done in the new education policy. Thank you.